Hello everybody, I'm ChibiJo and I'm here with another Elder Scrolls Readings. And we are still in the story of King Edward, but now we are in book 11 out of 12. The companions stayed the night at a crude but comfortable inn at a tiny village that called itself Raven Spring, located in the foothills of the Rothgarian Mountains. The next morning, they resumed their journey eastward, moving through rolling hills towards the Skyrim and Hammerfell borders, and camping the next 2 nights under clear, early summer skies. When they resumed traveling the third morning, Moralen told everyone to watch the slopes north of the road for a notch opening to a high meadow that faced to the southwest. Shortly afterward, everyone spotted it almost simultaneously when the group completed a bend around a rocky outcrop. Soak and Beach went ahead to scout a good route and to look for a campsite for the evening ahead. By dusk, they had covered most of the distance to the meadow, but still faced some stiff climbing the next morning. They agreed it was time to camp once again, but happily a lunchtime picnic seemed very likely the next day. By midday the next day, which was Loretus, the 5th of the mid-year, the companions were sprawled against a grassy slope within the dragon village. Having been joined by Akatosh and one other dragon, the second dragon was smaller than Akatosh and seemed to be female, although, characteristically, Akatosh had just introduced the dragon as Dabujin, with no further explanations being forthcoming. The 2 dragons politely chatted with the humanoids as they enjoyed their repast, though Dabujin flew off afterwards to arc gracefully above and then swoop down upon a steer in a grassy field some distance away. Akatosh had been watching Edward's reaction to this and asked, "What did you flinch, Edward? Dabujin has not eaten recently and really behaved no differently than you just have." Edward replied with a small smile, "I don't think that our meal was quite that violent in nature." Akatosh returned the smile but then responded, "A good reminder, then, that we are only similar rather than the same." Edward paused, squinting into the mid-afternoon sun, and then turned to the golden dragon. "Akatosh, why did you choose this spot for your village?" "Well, it was high enough up into the mountains to suit us, but flat enough for raising the cattle with trees for the deer, and is defensible for all of us. There is plenty of room for the humans to build their ranches and farms, and the elves are quite comfortable in the dense trees along the cliff edges. The adits and the surrounding cliff faces provide us access to our lairs, which we have located within the mining tunnel system. All in all, an ideal site for such an experiment involving this many races of beings. It even opens to the southwest, providing reasonable warmth for the smaller beings, with some protection from the elements during the colder months." Edward responded, "It is difficult for me to get used to the notion of a village without some central concentration of buildings, but perhaps these will be developed in the future. At least a few buildings for meetings and socializing, and I suppose that there are also some beautiful sunsets to be seen." The dragon smiled again, but replied, "Quite so, but I am the only one of the dragon kind to show any interest, and that was not a legitimate consideration when we chose this site." Then wistfully, "I wish that I could assemble the words to describe some of them. I have attempted this many, many times, but the results are just not very admirable." More briskly, "And by the way, we do intend to erect a meeting hall for the humanoids, and also some stores for barter and other exchanges of goods." Moran had wandered over and seated himself, and he asked, with a notable absence of the usual humanoid respect for dragons, "Whatever possessed you to attempt such a crazy experiment, Akatosh?" The dragon paused thoughtfully and then replied, "As is my wont, I had been analyzing. In this case, one might say the history of dragons' behavior. Clearly, our lengthy contest of resistance to these new Aurelian gods was futile, but it took many of our generations for us to realize and accept this. Then our next pattern was to isolate ourselves, even from each other, and to resist intrusion from any and all beings. The accepted course was to mate among ourselves and procreate our race. However, aside from that one activity, we fought any and all for our precious privacy." And really for no good reason except that we can be especially stubborn for a race. Edward said, "Then you maintained a pattern of behavior long after the reason for it was gone?" Akatosh looked a bit embarrassed. He said stiffly, "I believe that is what I just said. We are not the only sentient race to fall prey to that." Edward said, "The Archmagister has told me that much behavior is inborn." Morhalan smiled at him. "Inborn behavior patterns are a particular problem for long-lived species who change slowly as conditions change. We elves suffer from it even more than you short-lived humans, which is why we like to keep things as they are. Though life is change, and to resist it utterly is death. Dragons live far, far longer than even elves, and in consequence breed even more slowly. Still, who can say what alterations being born into a social setting may produce, for good or ill, in dragon behavior?" Alara had by this time joined the conversation, observed, "The Daedra must have been long pleased with dragon behavior." Akatosh responded, "Perhaps so, but I approached our queen with the suggestion more so, because it seemed clear to me that as a race we had fallen into a stasis, and we needed to break this shell in order to invigorate ourselves. She didn't quite agree with me, but perhaps because of my reputation, she told me to go ahead and make this attempt." By this point, all the companions were sitting within hearing range, and Matt says, "Did you have to get your queen's permission? And have there been many difficulties among the various races?" "Permission is not quite accurate in this case, Mats. Being the beings that we are, it was more so that I was obliged to tell her of this so that she would have the information. For example, other dragons regularly come to me with potentially military intelligence, following this same philosophy of preparedness." Mats grinned and said, "You mean just in case, right? But what about these elves and humans?" "Ah, humanoid lord and lady do set a remarkable example of tolerance and respect for differing shapes and customs. I owe a debt of gratitude to Morhalan for the loan of his smiths and miners, who have been most generous in sharing their knowledge and skills with the Bretons that my young friend Edward and I have persuaded to attempt settlement here. It is my experience that Bretons, well, many Bretons, will do virtually anything, so as long as it is profitable, they gain skill and knowledge from it. Nordic lust for individual honor and glory makes the mithril armor and weapons produced here extremely profitable. 'Twas sheer genius that inspired Alara to insist that we sell only to the nobility, while the delving opens new tunnels and provides access to that which we dragons require." Akatosh smiled a little slyly. He was very reticent on the subject of exactly what dragons required. Beech and Willow have made it known among their people that wood elves are welcome here, so those who have long missed their ancient high rock homes have returned to these hills. Fortunate for me that I'm now a duke, and thus qualified to wear and carry mithril. If only I could afford more than a piece or two, but for the cost I might retire." Matt said. "If you retired, you would not require the mithril," Morhalan pointed out. "What of my son and daughter? Thinkst thou I will bring from thee for them?" Matt said indignantly. "Mine ease and wind may not be what they once were, I grant you. In fact, I'm somewhat tempted to remain up here. Now I am here, yet I can still swing my axe with any." Myth grinned delightedly. "Nodes can't count. It's why they seek honor and glory, not profit. Honor and glory are not amenable to enumeration much past what one can tally on the fingers, Matt. If thou art but 39, thou wert the largest 10-year-old human I ever met or hoped to meet." "But what are these benefits to those who neither delve nor smith?" Matt persisted, ignoring his old friend. "I would think that many would be terrified to live so close to such formidable beings." Matt spoke the last of this with a sly grin. "Well, on the other hand, the presence of the formidable being means that they are certainly well protected, and this area is surprisingly fertile, so the crops seem to be growing well. And although they provide the meat for us, we allocate 1/5 of each herd to them for their own consumption. We've also been finding out what I have long suspected. The 3 sets of races, when combined, fight much more effectively than the sum of each when considered in isolation. That is, each race covers or cancels weaknesses of the other. At least it is certainly true that the local goblin population has been drastically reduced in a very short amount of time. Aye, Edward responded. So Moraylin proved in Morrowind. With a bit of help with his friends, Moraylin acknowledged. I reap the praise, but in truth I'm little more than the standard they wave, and at times I feel more like the target they set up. A wave of laughter greeted this remark. Edward persisted. With you and the others up here, Akatosh, I feel my borders are well guarded, should Skyrim ever feel the urge to move its borders west again. Elara asked, was it easy to convince the other dragons to move to here? Actually, the most difficult part of that was moving our hordes to our new lairs. Akatosh responded with a lazy smile. Although once it was known that we had no use for the metals, gems, and jewelry that we accumulate, everything went much more smoothly. But then more seriously, essentially, I had to approach each dragon personally and convince them that this idea had merit. Again, once I had persuaded a couple of our especially independent specimens, things went much more smoothly. However, there are only 9 of us living in this area, and there is really only room for 2 or 3 more of us. We shall have to see what develops hereafter. Elara now observed, I think that now the gods and goddesses might look very favorably indeed on dragon behavior. Well, that may be so, Elara, but again, that was not really why this was done. Besides, they still may remember and resent our long opposition to them. Beach asked deferentially. But what is the name of this village? Akatosh sighed and then responded, I fear that we shall never reach a decision, since each race has decided opinions in that regard. Perhaps once the initial building phase is completed, we will be able to be more contemplative about such matters. Beach replied, well, that just doesn't seem right. Everywhere should have a name, shouldn't it? Everywhere should have a name, shouldn't it? Willow chuckled and then said, perhaps to us this is so. But who knows how dragons think, and I'm sure that the humans and elves will squabble over the style of the name, besides the specifics of it. Merlin interrupted with great drama. Surely you don't mean to imply that an elf can be overly stubborn? And the discussion dissolved into a period of laughter and teasing amongst the group. Presently, Akatosh said, I favor the name Section 22. Beach stared at him. Akatosh, I see what thou dost mean by thy difficulties with the poetic. If you will allow my frank opinion, that is the single worst village name I have ever heard. Akatosh sighed gustily, then parted himself hastily to Beach. Humanoids found dragon size quite unpleasant and sometimes hazardous. Then thou seest what I mean by differences. To me it is very meaningful and most appropriate. Is Section 16 any better as a name? Not? Then is it the word section that offends you, in a way that it isn't inferior to keep, or reich, or glen, or hold? Edward said, but Akatosh, a name should make some sense. At least humans think so. You should have 21 other sections first, if you're going to name this place 22. Really? Akatosh said. Why is that? Are not all numbers equally valid? They serve well to distinguish one place from another. There could be many green vales, for instance. I myself know of 4 such villages. The name number 22 does appeal to me, aesthetically, as well as possessing some sense, at least to me. He smiled secretively. Moraylin said, I think Lord Akatosh is enjoying what some call an in-joke. Or I so rash as to instruct a dragon in manners. Who? Silk said, who would ever accuse Moraylin of being rash? A bit later, Edward asked Akatosh, do you think that we could play a game or two of battle? I brought the board and playing pieces with me. Moraylin interrupted. I'm afraid that Akatosh and I must discuss some matters this evening, and you'd only lose again anyway, he added with a fond smile. Edward replied, but I can beat everyone else, Akatosh. Will I ever win in a game with you? No, Edward, you won't, said I, and Akatosh was slightly bemused by Edward's startled expression, and then the hearty laugh that quickly followed it. That wasn't very diplomatic of you, Akatosh, but why won't I ever win? Because I have been playing for much longer than you have, Edward, and so long as I continue to play, you will not be able to catch up to me. Besides, this game is what I am starting to think of as a bounded problem, and that sort is most easily dealt with. What do you mean by a bounded problem, Akatosh? Asked Mats. That is a problem that has a countable number of possible actions and results, Mats. There are only 81 squares on the board, and each side has exactly 27 playing pieces, and each piece moves in a specific way, and so on. But the game is like a real battle, isn't it? Asked Yas. No, it is a very good practice for learning and for thinking about how to execute a battle. But my elven archers never become tired or demoralized, and my master mage always does what I want. Such things seldom happen in a real battle. Morelli nodded in agreement and asked him with mock slyness, then what is an example of an unbounded problem? Certainly a real battle, but also to me a poem is an unbounded problem. But any poem can be analyzed, Akatosh, Alara said shyingly. Of course, but only after it is written. I am unable to define or bound the act of writing it, though. That is, the act of creating it. If I start to write a poem, there are so many possibilities. And then Riley, I never get beyond the first line, because I start to imagining all the things that I could put into the beginning end. And that is part 11. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys on Thursday for the final part of King Edward. Have an awesome day and a good night.